The International Campaign for Justice in Bhopal is a collection of organizations that have joined together around the world to demand justice for the victims of Bhopal, and is led by survivors groups in India that have been waging an incredible struggle over the past 20 years demanding justice. These are some of the world's poorest, most destitute people, and they are fighting against two of the world's largest and most powerful corporations in the world. So this is a very significant struggle, but it's one that's led by the survivors' determination to settle for nothing less than justice.
You said two of the world's most powerful corporations. You're talking, of course, about Union Carbide and Dow Chemical.
That's right, both of them.
Explain, if you would, what happened at the Union Carbide pesticide plant in Bhopal, India on December 3rd and 4th of 1984.
Certainly. It was the world's worst industrial disaster. There was a catastrophic chemical leak at a Union Carbide plant in Bhopal, and this released 27 tons of methyl isocyanate, which was a very deadly chemical. And this chemical spread throughout the city of Bhopal, and it contaminated 500,000 people. 500,000 people were exposed to this gas. Of those, 20,000 have died, 8,000 in the immediate aftermath, and several thousand since then. About 120,000 are still suffering from the after effects of their gas exposure.
Now, this plant was closed. Union Carbide thought that India was a right place for its chemical plant, and as it turns out, it wasn't as profitable as they had hoped, and so it was sitting idle. Why was the plant not properly decommissioned?
This is a product of what actually created the situation, and that is that Union Carbide felt that it had to cut costs at the Bhopal plant. So what you saw was that costs were cut across the board in terms of safety, in terms of staff, in terms of training, and this is one of the reasons why the investment was not made to decommission the plant, because it would have cost Union Carbide money.
Explain, you said 27 tons of pesticides, gases escaped. How did that affect people physically? What was the situation on December 3rd and 4th?
The effect was immediate. People woke without any warning. They woke in their beds with the gas already in their eyes and in their faces and their lungs. So they woke with excruciating pain. They were forced to flee with whatever they were wearing. Wives were separated from their husbands. Parents were separated from their children. Everybody was running to save their own lives. Thousands of people were killed in the streets. Bhopal was turned into a gas chamber. Those that did survive were left at hospitals, and there was no real sense of how to treat the people who had suffered from this gas exposure.
Now, the plant apparently had 6 safety devices. Were they all 6 inoperable?
All 6 were inoperable. They were not functioning.
And can you explain who was in the plant at the time of the leak, or what precipitated that leak?
There was a skeleton staff of Indian engineers who were at the plant at the time. The staff was reduced to save money. The staff often was not trained to handle these kinds of situations. What happened was water was entered into the tank of methyl isocyanate. This tank held 40 tons of a highly reactive and dangerous chemical. Nowhere else on planet Earth at that time was this kind of quantity of chemical stored in one single place. This chemical reacts with water, and so when water was introduced, it created an exothermic reaction, and the chemical exploded out of the tank and spread throughout the city of Bhopal.
Now, you have described this as the longest-running struggle for corporate accountability and environmental justice in the world. What responsibility, if any, did Union Carbide take in 1984 for this accident?
In 1984, they were very reluctant to take any responsibility. They say now that they took more responsibility in 1989 when they settled a class action lawsuit filed by the Indian government. They settled the case for $470 million. This sounds like a significant sum of money, but when you spread it among 500,000 people, it's really not. And this settlement did not address the environmental contamination that Union Carbide left behind at the factory site. People are still suffering today, and people are still being poisoned today because Union Carbide has not taken responsibility.
Now, the company was bought out 17 years later by Dow Chemical, and on Dow Chemical's website, they say that this is an unfortunate disaster. They've started a program called Responsible Care, which they say will help prevent a situation like this happening in the future, but that this situation is not their responsibility. How do you respond to that?
This situation very clearly is their responsibility. They've maintained for years that they have no liability, and yet there are 2 outstanding court cases, one in the United States, one in India, that are seeking justice. The one in India is actually a criminal case. Criminal charges have been filed against Union Carbide. So this is a very serious offense. They're absconding from a criminal trial. So they are responsible. Now, they claim that they've formed this program, Responsible Care, which will prevent another accident like this happening in the United States. What we see, in fact, every week is that there are annually, there are weekly, there are monthly releases of chemicals that take place at chemical factories throughout the country. This is a very regular phenomenon. Nothing of the scale of Bhopal has happened, but it's still a very real possibility.
I want to get back to the Dow Chemical part of it, though. Again, Dow Chemical didn't own the plant at the time of the accident. So explain why they're responsible.
No, that's a very good question. They're responsible because when you buy a corporation, according to U.S., Indian, and international corporate law, you buy its liabilities along with its assets. You cannot have one without the other.
What's interesting about this is that Dow Chemical has bought other companies, and in fact in West Virginia where thousands of workers were contaminated with asbestos and suffered from lung cancers and other diseases, they did settle. Why is this different?
They did settle. They settled their liabilities in the United States, and they've refused to settle their liabilities in India. This is a very clear double standard where they feel that the lives of Indian victims are either worth less or that they can avoid assuming responsibility and liability because the legal system is different.
Now, this brings me to what's happening really in terms of globalization. I mean, I look at, in 2002, an oil tanker called Prestige sunk off the coast of Spain. It spilled 77,000 tons of oil. The Prestige was registered in the Bahamas. It was owned in Liberia. It was managed from Greece, carrying Russian oil for a Russian-owned Swiss company with British directors, and it was allowed to dock in Latvia and Singapore. I mean, we're talking about a very, very, in some cases, complicated corporate ownership web.
That's very true, and it's the case in this instance as well. And this is something that Dow relies on, is that they say, how can you hold us responsible for a chemical factory that we were not running at the time and that a company that we didn't purchase for 17 years after the disaster? This is what they say, and yet it's very clear in international law and U.S. law that they are liable.
Can you describe what you're doing and how much pressure is being brought to bear and really how optimistic you might be that something finally after 2 decades might settle this?
We are optimistic. We're cautiously optimistic of a settlement in the next few years. And we feel that this is likely because the international campaign for justice is stronger now than it ever has been before. There are more people in more countries around the world that are finding out about Bhopal, that are outraged that this disaster has been allowed to continue for 20 years. And so they are joining together with the survivors' organizations and the international campaign to demand justice. They are educating their fellow citizens about what happened in Bhopal. They are demanding that their investment funds divest from Dow Chemical. They are staging protests and demonstrations at Dow factories. These are all sorts of things that people are doing, and it's placing a very real pressure on the company.
If this accident were to happen today, do you think the outcome might have been different?
I would like to say yes. Unfortunately, because very little has changed in the regulatory structure since Bhopal, I would have to say no. And that is because still today there is no international regulatory accountability process for companies that have a disaster in a foreign country and they're based in another country, usually the United States. They can still get away with it, unfortunately, still today.
And the CEO from Union Carbide?
Oh, he's certainly gotten away with it. He's living a very comfortable life here in the United States. And he has not been forced to appear for trial in India, where he faces criminal charges. Instead, he's been allowed to abscond.
And on that note, we're out of time. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much.
A copy of the program you've just seen can be purchased through Penn State Media Sales at mediasales.psu.edu or by calling 800-770-2111.